Thank you, John. Welcome to Bali and welcome to the B20 Summit. My name is Rida Wirakusuma. I'm the chair of the B20 Finance and Infrastructure Task Force, and I'm also, at the same time, the CEO of Indonesia Investment Authority, or Indonesia Sovereign Wealth Fund, or mostly commonly called INA. I'll be presenting our task force final policy recommendations to B20, which will be part of the B20 communique, and highlight the importance of finance and specifically infrastructure to all of you. Infrastructure may mean different things for different people. In some part of developing nations, infrastructure or lack of infrastructure means going to school not by bus, but by boat, like what is happening today now in Banjarmasin in South Kalimantan, or going back from school in a crowded boat in a place like Kebumen in Central Java. It is therefore imperative that we, at the G20 countries, and for us through the B20 Finance and Infrastructure, develop recommendations that are inclusive, accessible, and affordable, that touches as many aspects of infrastructure for all G20 nations. This chart shows how important the appropriate infrastructure means for a country's competitiveness. It is worth noting, if you look at the right-hand chart, that the infrastructure competitiveness scores of developing nations of the G20 members fall way behind similar measure if compared to those of developed nations of G20. Furthermore, as infrastructure plays a direct impact on the overall human development, as measured by the index from the UNDP, yet again a focus on infrastructure as the main levers for such development is essential and critical. These are some of the main catalysts for B20 to put a strong focus on our finance and infrastructure task force. Supported by our knowledge partner PwC, as well as our network partners ADB, World Economic Forum, and ICC, and John Denton is here with us today, we carry on the task of the finance and infrastructure focus. Our task force is privileged to be joined by distinguished senior global leaders, including Marc-André Blanchard from CDPQ, John Denton from ICC, who's here with us today, Madame Hu Xiaolian, from the Export-Import Bank of China, Mark Tucker from HSBC, Ben Wei from Macquarie, and Bill Winter from Standard Chartered Bank. We are also helped by 115 executives from 25 different countries. If you look at the infrastructure gap, it's actually a pretty sad story because the gap is going to grow only bigger. And what I mean by the gap is the need of infrastructure and the delivery of infrastructure projects. And you can see here that the gap is expected to reach almost 15 trillion by 2040, of which 11 trillion is just for the G20 nations. Now, if you look at how big this gap is, pay attention to the next chart, because in this chart, ironically, the supply of capital, of the money part, the world is actually flush with cash. By 2025, which is not too far from now, it is estimated that there will be more than 120 trillion US dollars in institutional assets like pension funds, insurance company, sovereign wealth funds like the ones I'm representing. On top of that, there's $120 trillion from very rich individuals, including 100 trillion from mass affluent. So if you look at it, there are so much money. So the gap between what infrastructure need and the money available is actually extremely imbalanced. However, it is not easy to actually finance those infrastructure. If you look at this background, this is happening to be an Autobahn in Germany. Financing infrastructure is complex, tedious, and oftentimes very time-consuming. Such complexity is usually translated that to finance an improvement in autobahn is much easier than to actually build a toll road in a developing nation. On the left-hand side, KKR, for example, a firm that I used to work for, raised money, about $17 billion, but it also says that it will be focusing only on OECD and developed nations. The similar thing for GIP, which raised $13.5 billion. They say specifically they want to raise money so that they could improve infrastructure in the developed nations. For countries like Indonesia and other developing nations, to develop a toll road, it actually has strained public sector budgets as well as resources of state-owned enterprises. So I think it's actually very important. The money is available, but it's not that easy to actually finance infrastructure. Why is that so difficult? There are many, many barriers for private sector to come in and invest in infrastructure. For example, there's lack of properly prepared projects, or the legal and regulatory are very, very uncertain, and sometimes there are currency risk. So sometimes you can blame the people that actually have the money, but sometimes you actually have to also pay attention that it is not easy to do an investment in infrastructure. Based on these challenges and opportunities, we have developed 4 policy recommendations, each with several policy actions as detailed in our policy papers, and I will highlight those here. The first recommendation we make is to improve access and affordability and suitability source of financing. Our task force detailed 2 specific policy actions to help narrow the infrastructure gap. The first one is to improve public sector support, such as the blended finance mechanism, so as to spread the risk while promoting investments and lending into infrastructure. The second policy recommends implementation of improved public sector policy to help project viability. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation is actually pretty much tied almost closely to our energy and sustainable task force led by Ibu Nika, i.e. to drive collaborations between countries to accelerate the transition toward a net zero world, but from the infrastructure perspective. Our task force detailed 3 specific policy actions to help this recommendation. Number 1, the policy implementation to increase the pool of funds in green infrastructure. Number 2 is to improvement in investment climate for decarbonization projects. For example, in the energy transition mechanism that I personally involved in my other capacity, which is not necessarily easy to do because the taxonomy is actually not there yet, and it has been proven to be extremely difficult, but I'm happy to report to you that we will be announcing our progress on the energy transition mechanism tomorrow. Number 3 is the improvement support for better viability in green infrastructure. So that's the second recommendation. The third recommendation is to accelerate the development adoption of digital and smart infrastructure so that when you build infrastructure, you do it smarter and you do it through the use of digital. I understand that I'm actually going very, very fast, but this is actually just a highlight. We actually have a lot of details as you go through our policy papers. The last one is all of this can only be done if financial regulation that provides the supportive changes in the infrastructure needs to strike the right balance between growth, productivity, and stability, and not just solely for growth at all costs. Again, as I mentioned to you, I encourage you to read the policy paper we have developed to appreciate the full details of our policy recommendations. Throughout the process, we have grown to appreciate the nature of infrastructure projects that requires partnership, collaboration, cooperation, the long-term nature of the investment and financing, as well as other points I listed here. Finally, on behalf of all those involved in putting together the finance and infrastructure policy papers, co-chairs, members, knowledge, and network partners, I extend our most sincere gratitude for the hard work, the collaboration, the constructive feedback, and input. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rita, and it's been a pleasure to serve on your task force. It's been great working with you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Usman Chung, who's Executive Chair of Hyundai Motor Group, to provide a keynote address to us all. Usman, over to you.